Peace to you and grace. Thank you for joining me this morning. It's Thursday, May 25th, and we are looking at John chapter 15 and Jesus' final I am statement. Now, uh, we are familiar, if you're familiar with the Gospel of John, you know that this is the last time he says I am. When they come to arrest him, he says, I am he or I am. When they ask, who's Jesus, and he says I am, and people fall backwards. And so that's actually like the last time he uses the phrase I am. But for the purposes of this study, we're looking at here just the final I am statement, where he explains something about himself and his connection to the Hebrew scriptures and the person of God, which we've looked at with the other statements already. So here, John chapter 15, we're starting at verse 1. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, he trims so that it may bear more fruit. You are already you are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I will abide in you. The branch cannot itself produce fruit unless it abides on the vine. Likewise, you cannot produce fruit unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. The one who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and is dried up. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it shall be done for you. In this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. Just as the Father has loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, so that my joy may be in you, that your joy may be. This is my commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, than he laid down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I am no longer calling you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. Now I have called you friends, because everything I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. We're going to end here in verse 17. You did not choose me, but I chose you. I selected you so that you would go and produce fruit, and your fruit would remain. Then the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. These things I command you, that you may love one another. So, with context, it's always interesting, important to see the setting in which these things take place. And at the end of chapter 14, we see Jesus say, "Get up, let's go from here." And that's speaking of the upper room where they were having their final Passover, and Jesus washed his disciples' feet and was giving the whole teaching about, where I'm going, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And now they leave that place and they go, and presumably right now where they are at, where John is recording this conversation from, or it was remembering it from the setting, is the same garden, the Garden of Gethsemane that Jesus ends up getting arrested in. So they travel, from where they were at the upper room to this place, which was kind of it was a secret place for them to be able to gather and be able to spend time together outside of Jerusalem without having to worry about somebody uh, finding them, arresting them, which is what was going on at this moment. They knew that the Pharisees and everyone was looking for them and looking for Jesus specifically because they wanted to arrest him and put him on trial. And that's why Judas' betrayal, they needed Judas to betray Jesus because they needed a disciple to say, hey, to tell them where his secret place was. And it was in this garden. I believe this garden was one that had olive vines, like an olive tree and olive and vines and grapevines, I should say, not olive vines, olive trees and vines, maybe grapevines, whatever. So if you can just imagine the setting, they're in a garden setting, and it's more like a secret place So it's concealed, maybe surrounded by trees and bushes or whatever. The same garden that Jesus prays in, asks the Father to take the cup from him, just a very private, secluded location. And while he's sitting there, he's finishing up his teaching with them, his last moments with them before he goes to the cross, before he's crucified. And so he uses that analogy of I am the true vine. And I've heard many people make this point before in their teaching, and it's a good point, that he's using a very natural idea from the surrounding he's in to say, hey, this is, these are vines here. Look at these vines. I am the true vine. I am the true branch. Every branch in me, and he makes the analogy and comparison. But the point that he's making is actually more closely related to more. It's more than just a setting. It's history. It's scriptures. Okay, and what we need to look at, the primary scripture here is found in the book of Isaiah. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 5, verse 1, and you're gonna hear some similarities here between what Isaiah is saying, uh, that he's being told by Adonai, by the Lord, and his message to the people, and and then what Jesus says to his disciples, and we see parallels there. So starting verse 1, Isaiah chapter 5. Let me sing of my beloved, a song of my beloved about his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard in a very fertile hill. He dug it out and cleared its stones. He planted it with a choice vine, built a tower in the midst of it, even cut out a winepress. He expected it to yield good grapes, but it yielded worthless grapes. So now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, please judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done? Why then, when I expected it to yield good grapes, so did it yield worthless grapes? So now I will make known to you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge, and it will be eaten up. I will break down the fence, and it will be trodden down. I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, but briars and thorns will come up. I will also command the clouds not to rain on it. For the vineyard of Adonai Baot is the house of Israel. That means the Lord of armies. And I don't think I pronounced it right. I was practicing and practicing. But Baot, Zvaot, uh, is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah. I should start over. So for the vineyard of Adonai Zvaot is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah, the planting of his delight. He looked for justice, behold, bloodshed; for righteousness, but behold, cry. So looking at this passage, and then also considering what we have here, where Jesus is saying, I am the true vine, I think the parallel to what Jesus is teaching, the concept of which he's teaching to his disciples is clear. And again, we don't have to assume that they know or they don't know Isaiah chapter 5. They know it. Their culture, especially at this time, they said before, was built on the idea that everybody needs to read the scriptures. Okay, everybody needs to read it. And those students, so they went to school, they read it. When we look at it sometimes in our own time, like I don't automatically think, oh, Isaiah chapter 5. When I hear I'm the true vine, I have to say, well, okay, I'm familiar with that. My mom made us read the Bible in 1 year, like before we could, in this, I remember in the summer, we'd have to read those Bible in 1 year passages. So we'd have to cram that all in one, in one summer. And I remember multiple times having to do that. And so what that did for us, we had to do that before we could go play outside or whatever. And what that did for me specifically was it, because of the way my memory works, I have a good memory to where things should be, or like that there's something there, right? I don't always know the specifics. I'm not always like, oh, it's Jeremiah chapter 42. No, it's not always like that accurate, but I have a good concept of stuff being places. So when I read Tree Vine, I'm like, I know that's in the Old Testament. I think it's Isaiah, and then I have to look it up. I actually remember as I'm reading this that a cousin of mine spoke on, I believe, this passage. I remember the wine press and this whole thing. Although it's a concept repeated in Isaiah and other places. So anyway, that's where their mind would go. he's speaking about the prophecy in Isaiah, specifically the prophecy to Judah, Jerusalem. If you recall, the northern kingdom fell first. The Samaritan Jews, the guy, that we are familiar with, that whole part of the nation fell first about 200 something years, around 200, maybe a little less than that years, before Judah finally fell to Nebuchadnezzar. And so this prophecy by Isaiah was to them. And we saw that in the passage here, specifically at the end, where this whole concept of a vineyard and God planting a vineyard and expecting good grapes and everything else, and that all failing is explained for us what the analogy is about in verse 7. So we don't have to guess. We don't have to try to figure out what this means. It says in verse 7, the vineyard is the house of Israel and the people of Judah. So it's actually including like the entire nation, the planting of his delight. So when he planted these people into this land, he expected it to produce good fruit. Why then, when I expected it to yield good grapes? So he was expecting good grapes, good fruit from this people, right? In verse 3, so now inhabitants of Jerusalem, people of Judah, please judge between me and my vineyard, because when he took care of the land, he dug it out, cleared its stones, planted with a choice vine, built a tower on it. I don't know about you, but I've during the pandemic, I really got into my yard. I've always had plants, but I never really like took care of them. But during the pandemic, you have things to do. What are you going to do with this time? We can't go anywhere. Well, I put time into my yard, and I thought about what I wanted to plant, and I thought about how to make them grow. The things that were already planted, why aren't they doing well? There's these crepe myrtles I have that they were in the ground, and so I had to dig them out and clear stones. I realized the roots weren't going down deep, and so that's why it wasn't producing as much as it should have been. And that's the work God did before he planted, right? I did it after I planted, but before he planted, he made sure that everything was good. He even put a tower there to make sure that he can have a wine press, because he expected good grapes to come. It says there in verse 3. But then uh what happened? That's what he says in verse 3. Like, judge between me and my dinner. Like, is there something that I didn't do right? That was my problem. I didn't clear away stones. I didn't put proper nutrition in the soil, like, having the right kind of organic matter. And so I had to redo things, and things are looking better than they were before. God's like, I took all that stuff, I did all those right things, and I expected good grapes, but I got worthless grapes that were thin, without a good skin, without much juice in it, so I can make the wine and make what I want to do from that. And so as a result, he took away the hedge, like, just like the idea of the border, the protection that goes around the vineyard. You got to protect it from other animals coming in. Sometimes they put a hedge of thorns around it, so that if animals come, like, oh, I want to get those grapes, but there's thorns, like, I can't get. He goes, I'm going to take away the protective hedge and let it be eaten up, because what's the point? I'll break down the fence. So I had a fence out there. Let it be trodden down. Like, I will lay it waste. It won't be pruned, or taken care of. And I've got in the front yard right now, I've got like I've got pruning to do, and I've got hoeing to do. I've got to take out weeds and stuff. And he says, I'm going to stop doing all that stuff, and I'm going to tell the clouds, don't rain on it. Which, for the people of Israel, like, rain was a symbol of God's blessing, because they needed the rain. Without the rain, they weren't going to be able to grow the crops and to have the abundance that they were going to have. He's like, I'm going to just stop the rain on it. And the reason why is, now, like we said in verse 7, it's all allegory, it's metaphor. And verse 7 tells us exactly what the vineyard was. The vineyard was the house of Israel and the people of Judah. The planting, when he planted, was his delight. And now, what was the grapes? And that's the key thing. Like, what's the fruit? What's the fruit? Because Jesus refers to that fruit in John chapter 15. I'm the vine, the fruit, and producing, and everything else. So what is the fruit he was looking for with his people, and why did he determine it was worthless? Verse 7, he looked for justice. That would have been a grape of high value, a fruit of great value, justice. But behold, bloodshed, murder, death. That's a worthless that's a worthless fruit to our God. he looked for righteousness, and righteousness has to do with the concept of tzedakah, of blessing others and taking care of others who are less fortunate of you. Not a lot of times righteousness it's been turned into in our day this personal sinlessness or this personal right walking. And while it is about our personal walk and being on the right path, the concept is directly tied into our taking care of those who need to be taken care among us. And James talked about how true religion is about taking care of widows and the orphans. And so righteousness is specifically our right walking and right path in the midst of in terms of how we treat those who are lesser than us. And no matter what position we're in, there are always those who are lesser than us. And so he looked for righteousness, but hold a cry from those who are less fortunate. They're not being taken care of. And so when we look back at this teaching then about him being the true vine, he's referring to the nation itself. Is like, look, the nation of Israel, Judah, they were a vineyard that God planted, right? But I want to show you something here. He said they were a vine, choice vine. So they were like the vine that when you go to if you go to a store like Home Depot or something, you're buying a plant and you look at, they have so many of the same ones, but you look for the choice one. And the choice one is the one that doesn't have marks on it, doesn't isn't being eaten up by pests. It looks like it's got good solid roots. It looks like I like to buy things that are about to bud, not ones that are have already budded, so that when I plant them, they can grow and they can bud and they can produce while I can see them and not, transfer the home and then the flowers are falling off and they're dying already. That was Israel. That was Judah. But all of those vines, all those plants, they come from a choice, a true stock, right? That a seed or whatever that was planted, and whoever grew them brought them here, and they keep the ones that was good for them at their home. Like I've got some plants that I cut branches off, I put in rooting mix, I put it in soil, I let them they grew roots, I let them grow big, stronger, and then I took them up to my mom's house and planted them because she liked them a lot, right? And yet the parent vines, the true plants, are here still at home, and I can still make more. She actually asked, "Can you make more for a friend of mine?" I was like, "Yeah, I'll do that." That is what Jesus is referring to. I am the true vine. I am the source. I am the original one. Okay, I am the true vine. And in truth, what he's saying is, I'm what Israel was supposed to be. I'm what the nation of what Judah was supposed to be in truth. We talked about that yesterday. I am the way, the truth, and life. God's truth and his light combined exposes a reality, the reality that God understands and God knows. And so what Jesus is saying is, I am that true vine. It's not Israel anymore. It's not Judah. Not that they're not still a vine, but it's, we saw in Isaiah like what God did there to them. But he's saying ultimately, I'm the truth in this picture of what the vine is supposed to be, from Isaiah chapter 5. And every branch in me that doesn't bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he trims. And this is about judgment. Okay, this is about judgment and pruning and discipline. And we saw that in the Isaiah passage, how he says, "I will not. It will not be pruned, but briars with thorns will grow up." So here's one thing, right? He says, "I'll break down the fence. I'll let it be trodden." So Jesus says two things here. He says, every branch that does not bear fruit, he's going to cut it and throw it away. In the book of Ezekiel, this concept is repeated. He says, "Therefore, thus says Adonai Elohim, like the vine's wood among the trees of the forest that I have given to the fire for fuel, so I will give up the inhabitants of Jerusalem. I will set my face against them. Even if they come out of the fire will yet devour them. So you'll know I am Adonai when I set my face against them." And there, the prophecy is about ultimately about judgment. Like when things are not going well, he's going to cut off the branches. He's going to throw it into a fire, and he's going to let it burn. And for Jesus and in his analogy, he says God is going to continue to do that. Any branch that doesn't bear fruit, anything that's a part of me isn't bearing fruit. And remember, we're talking about the the fruit of value, right? The opposite of worthless has value, and that's the in according to the Isaiah passage. That's the justice and the righteousness, taking care of others. In this passage, there's a uh, an all-encompassing concept that grabs both of those ideas, and we'll get to that in a second. But here he says, if it doesn't bear fruit, he takes it away. And later on in this passage, he talks about how he's going to throw it into the fire. Okay, in right here in verse 6, he says he is thrown away. So if anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and is dried up. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. A direct reference to the passage there in Ezekiel chapter 15. That was Ezekiel chapter 15 verses 6 through 8 that we earlier. And so you can see Jesus is making these connections to these passages and these concepts and these ideas. If you don't produce the fruit, you're going to be taken and burned up. And just like the nation in the past was, and for them it was like really extreme because they were taken into captivity, and for this generation, the reason why they're so into reading the scripture, the reason why they put their kids through school and they make them read the Torah and everything else, and then if they show like a special aptitude in understanding scripture, then they would graduate them into becoming scribes and lawyers and everything else, because they wanted more and more people to study the scriptures and know the scriptures, because they felt that the previous leadership failed to do that. They failed to get the people to understand the teachings of Moses and to understand the law and understand their responsibilities. And so they put the blame on a lack of knowledge, which is what God prophesies, like my people die for lack of knowledge. So they were trying to solve that problem by making sure people read the scriptures and understood them. And what Jesus is doing is he's using those scriptures to help them understand in this analogy that that can still happen, and there's something you're afraid of being cut off and thrown into the fire, everything everybody's aware of, that level of judgment can still happen. And so he says every branch that does not bear fruit he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit he trims so that it could bear more fruit. That's the act of pruning. And if you're not familiar with plants and pruning, every it's an important idea, an important process to help a plant grow. And so, like I talked about the Durantas I have earlier, I mentioned earlier, I prune them. I do major prunings twice a year. Once before spring, and then once before, probably like in the middle, at the end of summer, I should say, when the dry season starts. So it's not like perfect timing, but that's when I do it. The reason why you need to prune is because you have plants that, and I do root pruning too. So that's when they're in pots. So they're in big pots. So I take them out. The roots have grown a certain length. They sometimes grow too long, and they come out of the pot, and so you need to cut them. I trim them about 25 to 30% of their length, and then I put them back in the pot with new soil. And then I cut off all the branches and take off every leaf. Then I take off every leaf. The reason why is because if I don't, after doing the root pruning, I have to do because they're in pots, right? If they're just growing on the ground, I could just leave it. But they're growing in pots. I don't want to keep buying bigger pots. I need to do root pruning. What happens is the plant uh, starts to wither because I cut all the roots off. Not all the roots, like 25-30%. And so the leaves are drooping and the flowers are dying. And so the best thing to do then is to cut off all the branches and leaves and just cut it down to the stem, to those branches. And then within a couple weeks, it starts growing again. The reason why, because any plant that you have will attempt to keep feeding and nurturing a branch, even if it's not doing well. Okay, so if you've got a branch and a plant that's kind of withered, or there's some kind of problem with the branch, the leaves are dying, the roots, the plant itself is going to keep putting energy towards trying to fix it, and so sometimes you just have to remove it so that it can grow something new. Right, that's one thing. Pruning itself, let's say you have a plant like mine, like, and it's just not growing enough flowers or enough fruit. I will cut them and have them regrow, because again, the root system is supporting something in a way that I don't want it to support. And so by pruning, I can get it's like hitting a reset button. And what Jesus says here is that every branch that produces fruit, he trims so they can bear, he's going to prune it so they can bear even more fruit. Okay. And that's just like a really practical lesson there, a true vine. And so what Jesus is saying is no longer is God going to leave the land. Remember, we read earlier in Isaiah, we read how, he's removing the hedge and he's removing the fence, and he's going to let thorns grow on the land. He's going to let all this kind of stuff just go over it because he's not going to take care of it anymore. Jesus is explaining now, listen, he's going to work on this vine because guess what? I'm the vine. It's no longer, just like the nation of Israel, like I am the vine. And from me, this new plant is going to grow. And this new plant is made up of you guys, right? And the key to stay a part of this vine is to abide in him. He says the branch itself cannot produce fruit unless it abides on the vine. Likewise, you cannot produce fruit unless you abide in me. Now, what does it look to produce the fruit and to abide in him? Well, he refers to this new commandment that he gave his disciples at the end of John chapter 13. So it's the same night before they walked out to this garden. In verse 9, he starts to speak to it. He says, because he's talking about bearing fruit, and we read this earlier, abide in me, you bear fruit. The Father's glorified, you bear fruit. Verse 9 says, just as the Father's loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in me, abide in my love, excuse me. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I've spoken to you so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be full. And here's the key, this is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, than he that lays down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. And what is he commanding? What is the fruit that he expects to see his disciples producing? It's the fruit of love. And in the fruit of that love, he's giving them a really important mission. You think about this, like he's leaving, right? He's going to be crucified, he's going to rise again, and he's going to go. And then he's leaving them with one of the most important parts of the mission, and that's the bringing back together of Israel. If you remember, like John's gospel is about this concept: Jesus is the King of Israel. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is going to join the two branches together, reference to Ezekiel's prophecy. And so now, like the bringing together of the people of Israel into one into one again is going to be on them. I mean, he's been going and he's been preaching and he's been showing his signs, miracles so they can see it. But now it's going to be up to them to go out into that world and start giving them this fuller understanding of who God is, because again, they're all thinking he's going to reign, but and he's going to rise again, but instead he's going to be crucified. So they're going to experience this letdown, like, oh man, Jesus died. He was supposed to be the Messiah, the King of Israel. What happened? And then he's going to ascend, and there's time where he stays and everything else before he ascends. But it's going to be up to them now to go out there with the power of the Spirit that God's going to give them, which we're going to look at tomorrow. Tomorrow's lesson this weekend being Shavuot, or the day of Pentecost, it's called in Western Christianity. And it's going to be on them to share with them the fullness of what the Messiah has done, his resurrection, his ascension, his gifting of the Spirit, and now their mission to go out and make disciples of all the nations, not just Israel, but all the nations. Maybe look at the story of Acts, like it's a story where disciples are doing that, and the sharing of the gospel, and with not the gospel, the sharing of this message with the Samaritans, and then receiving the Spirit. If you remember, Philip, I believe it's Acts chapter 8, Philip goes to the Samaritans and he tells them the gospel and they believe, but then they don't receive the Spirit, and he asks Peter to come help him because for some reason they haven't received the Spirit. And I think that's tied into what Jesus told Peter he was going to have authority over, in what's in heaven, hell, and the keys and everything else in the Gospel of Matthew. And so Peter came and he prayed and asked the Father to give them the Spirit, and then they received the Spirit. And so Jesus is saying, like, you're going to go out there, and this is going to be your job now. You're going to help bring people into this vine. But in order for you to do that, you need to abide in me and produce the fruit that I'm asking you to fruit. And that fruit is the fruit of love. Because through this fruit, the fruit of love, everybody's going to know that you are my disciples, that this is my community. And what's going to happen is then through the fruit of through love, okay, by abiding in his love, abiding in the same love that the Father has for him, you're going to go out there and you're going to unify the people of Israel into this new branch or this new vine. And it's a new way, it's a new faith. We're not throwing away the Torah. Jesus said that. Like, the Torah is going to be eternal. Not one little jot or tittle is going to be gone. But the importance of the Torah is understanding Jesus' interpretation of it and Jesus' teaching of it. And that's also related to these commands that he's talking about here. But the main thing is the command that they would love one another. And I've mentioned this before. If you want to know, like, how does Jesus interpret the Torah, you have to, that's what the Gospels are, they're written for us to help us understand how he interprets the Torah. This Gospel of John tells us how he interprets the Torah and what it means for God to be light, what it means for God to be the bread of life, what it means for him to be the way, the truth, and the life, for him to be the good shepherd, for him to be the gate, for him to be the true vine. He's taking the Torah, he's taking the scriptures, and he's applying it to himself, and he's giving us a fresh perspective. He's also taking those verses about lust and adultery, and he's accentuating and he's highlighting and bringing them up, and he's saying, listen, you can't even hate your brother, you can't even lust after women, right? I know I've mentioned that before. You're supposed to love your enemies and pray for them. And so Jesus is giving us the Torah, but his twist on it, his explanation of it, its growth out of him, and then his fulfillment of it. How he fulfills the Torah is through his sacrifice, and how then the system of sacrifice is no longer needed because he's fulfilled them all perfectly, right? There's not this year after year of presenting the blood of bulls and goats. We no longer need that for our atonement. We have his sacrifice, which satisfies God's need for atonement. Now we can come to God boldly, understanding our responsibilities and what the scriptures teach, and so on and so forth, and that He is fulfilling all of that in His new community, the way it's supposed to be fulfilled, and everything's going to grow from Him. It says in verse 13 or verse 15, "I no longer call you servants." So it's, for some people, it's like, what? No longer? Yes, students of a rabbi were known as the servants of that rabbi, and so they served him in whatever he needed. Now he was elevating them. He's already that's why when he washed their feet, they were, Peter freaked out. He's like, hey, we're your servants. Like, you're not supposed to do that. And he was showing them, and that's really the ultimate contextualization of all of this stuff, is that image of him washing their feet. He said, this is what you need to abide in. This love is what you need to follow. This commandment is what you need to obey. And now I'm calling you friends, because you're no longer my servants. And being friends, we are now side by side with him. You've been elevated. It's like graduating. It's like when I get my students who get their master's degree, or if you get a doctorate degree, and it's like all of a sudden they're like, doctor, like, you've been elevated to this position. We're saying you're graduated now. You're no longer servants. You're now my friends. And now it's time for you to go out there and produce. So it says in verse 16, I selected you so you would go and produce fruit, and your fruit would remain. Then the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. These things I command you so that you may love one another. And just for time's sake, I think I'm going to end there. There's so much more to teach, with the world hating them, and everything else, and the word that you spoke, and that's, it's important. But I think for time's sake, I'm going to go ahead and stop here. But ultimately, the purpose of I Am True Vine is for them to think about what God really wanted to do when He planted Israel. That's for that to be a nation that grew and exhibited justice and righteousness. to others. And again, righteousness is not like, oh, I'm right and I do things good. Righteousness in that how they care for those who are least among them, for the foreigner to walk into their land and for them to clothe them and feed them and give them work and say, hey, listen, you belong here. This is now your nation and this is our God, and you can have him as your God as well, because that was the way things worked back then. Like every nation had their God, and God wanted the God of Israel, the God of the universe, wanted His people to be a place where others came and they saw that they were fair, they were just towards each other, they took care of the poor, they took care of the least of them, their widows and everything else, and they so that people could see that this God that lived here, that was the God of this nation, is the one true God, and I'm going to worship this God. I'm going to make him my God. Failed in that. They failed in justice. They failed in their righteousness. They're taking care of those who are least of them. And now Jesus is saying, listen, this is the truth. This is what I want. I am the true vine. You're going to grow from me. And remember everything that I have declared and taught. And now go out there and taught you and prepared. And now abide in that and abide in my love, meaning remain in it, abide in it, live in it, dwell in my love. For mental health, one of the reasons why I was doing the stuff with the plants and everything is because I needed to get off of the social media. Even though we were locked down, we still have the internet, right? We had TV to watch, we had their phones to look at, and honestly, like what I saw online, especially since I'm on Reddit more than anything else, and you still see it, and like Reddit's like public freak out or whatever, just people just so angry. They were fighting each other and hitting each other and shooting each other. And at first you're just like, wow, look at this drama. But when you see it over and over again, it feeds into you in such a way where it's hard to abide in the love of God. And I was hearing this message about faith over fear, like with the coronavirus, and faith over fear, meaning like have faith, and don't be fearful, and don't get the vaccine or whatever, or don't cover up, like don't worry about it, whatever the message was. I just remember seeing those signs. And so then it can make you think like, oh, maybe my faith isn't strong enough. I'm isolating or quarantining with my family and wearing masks, I'm wearing gloves, I'm wiping everything down. Do I have faith? And it dawned on me, the Spirit spoke to me and said, it's not about faith over fear. Fear is nothing to do with faith. Faith can't solve fear. You can have all the faith in the world and still have fear. What helps us with fear is love. That's First John chapter 4. That perfect love casts out fear. And the way that we could help each other and stop fighting with each other and shooting each other, yelling at each other. Some lady yelled at me at one point in the pandemic about me wearing a mask because I put on my mask in the car, uh, and then I walked to the store and she yelled something about there's no COVID in the parking lot or something, and that had nothing to do with my faith, right? It's like if I had the faith, no one would yell at me like to not wear it. It has nothing to do with faith, but that the fear, and it wasn't even fear either, but whatever was going on there, that was the only way to deal with that, um, is love, right? My faith alone won't help me deal with the rudeness and meanness and anger of other people. What will help me deal with it is the love that I can abide in, that's found in Jesus, and I can have for that person. And what that looks like is as soon as they yell at me, in love, in an active love, even if I can't say anything because she's driving away in her car, or in the pickup truck, I forgive them. That's what abiding in his love looks like. When somebody cuts me off on the highway, abiding in his love is forgiving that person for what they've done, to jump in front of me, to disrespect me, to cause me fear, whatever it might be. If someone gets into a 10 items or less line and I'm looking at it and it's getting me angry and I see that they've got 15 items there in front of me, the way I overcome that mentally and spiritually is to forgive them if it really does offend me, right? At some point, the love inside of you will grow to the point where it doesn't really matter to you what other people do. it doesn't affect you or offend you in that way. Now, there are things that people do that are outright wrong and require justice and require the an act of justice to take place, right? For someone in authority to deal with. And so for that, like love covers a multitude of sins, but ultimately, people do need to be held accountable. But do we hold them accountable by yelling at them and cussing them out in a grocery store? Do we hold them accountable by punching them and knocking them out while we're at a gas station? That doesn't accomplish justice. In the system of justice and everything else in the country, we can always complain about it. It's never going to work and call 911, get the police there to deal with this person, hit or miss whether or not they're going to do something that satisfies us. But we have to trust in those systems. We have to. We can't take things into our own hands and become Batman, becoming a vigilante. We have to love and abide in that love, and abiding in that love, as we love, we strive to love, he will prune. So let's say we're growing, we're a branch, or we're he's the true vine. We're growing from him. Let's say we have multiple branches that are connected to us, and I've got one branch that's producing fruit. Let's say that branch is in my family. In my family, I show love, I show patience, I show concern, forgiveness. I don't always do, but let's say hypothetically that's it. Let's say another branch is how I am at work. Another branch is how I am in public. And let's say those two other branches aren't really growing that well. They're not growing fruit. The one at home is growing well. So what God will do, he'll cut those two branches off. And I'm not talking about uh, you know, making me lose my job. Uh or whatever it might be. It's just the pruning process. And sometimes the pruning process does hurt. There's events that happen. I don't know. I don't know what that's exactly going to entail. But he prunes those branches, and then they start to grow back, and then he tries to see, like, is this fruit of love going to grow here? And I think when we have hardships in places, we discover more about ourselves. And I was realizing that I was having hardship, I was having anxiety when I'd go out in public because I'd been watching all these videos and I'm seeing people fight. I'm thinking, is someone going to say something to me? I'm wearing a mask. Is someone going to be rude and derogatory? And that's happened, right? And I've had people say racist things to me out in public and here in Miami and other places. And it's just, and so the anxiety was building up inside of me, anxiety, like who's going to say something? Am I going to be prepared? Am I going to say what I need to say? But ultimately, the pruning that took place was this realization that in those spaces, I need to have the same love I have for my family there, for the people that I don't know. That was the realization. And the pruning, part of that pruning was like panic attacks, anxiety, this feeling like, oh man, what's going on with me? Not knowing what to do, uh, and and just my symptoms. And I realized like I need to deal with this. And I realized what needed to be cut out of my life was this worry about what other people are going to do to me, and just focus on how I can love them, how I can love them. It had nothing to do with my faith. It wasn't my faith that needed to conquer my fear. It was about my love casting the fear away. And so uh, that's what I had to learn there, and that's how the pruning worked in my life. It was like a mental health thing that I felt I needed to address, and I addressed it. God addressed it through that, and that's been helpful. And it's not perfect. I still have those attacks, but not nearly as often, and they're just triggered by other settings. And so I know that there's other things I need to work on. Alrighty, so I am done here. Going to go ahead and wrap up. Tomorrow, I want to cover, like I said earlier, uh, Shavuot, the festival of weeks. I believe we call it the Day of Pentecost. It's the giving of the Torah and giving of the Holy Spirit, and so that's actually like tomorrow is the eve of that, and then Sabbath would be the actual holiday and remembrance of that occasion. So it kind of wrapped up nicely for us this week to be able to do that. And I think for next week's study or the next series of studies, I'm going to look at spiritual abuse. I had some questions about spiritual abuse, some going back to like over a year ago, some more recent. I think I'd like to cover spiritual abuse and Diane Langberg's book on spiritual abuse. And so we'll talk more about that probably on Monday. Anyway, thank you again for watching. Hope this is a blessing. Remember to share with your friends, subscribe if it's helpful, liking to remember. But I'm not big. I'm not trying to like build a bunch of subscriptions, and I'm just trying to, you know, offer something to people that want it. So if you know someone who wants it, please share with them the links on YouTube or the website, thilefots.com, or the Twitch site if they want to watch. We can build a community here, watch together, and Bible study together. All right, thank you again, and God bless you.